Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. Snow lay thick across the high Montana ridges, the kind that didn't melt till spring and liked to whisper underfoot when you walked on it. A gray curtain of clouds hung low enough to snag on the treetops, and the wind came slithering down the mountainsides in long, icy breaths. Jedediah Calhoun had been out here for 30 winters, and every one of them had carved its mark into him. His beard was as white as the snowfields, and his shoulders carried the kind of stoop a man gets from years of hauling elk quarters and firewood. He'd outlasted 3 rifles, 4 horses, and more trouble than most men would stomach in 2 lifetimes. His place sat at the bend of Lost Timber Creek, a place you wouldn't find unless you already knew it was there. The creek's waters came down clear and fast from the high snowmelt, then slowed near yet spread, where they widened enough for beaver to work their trade. The ranch wasn't much to look at, just a cluster of log buildings tucked under. The lee of a hill, a main cabin, 2 smaller bunkhouses left over from when he'd hired hands during his first years, and a big weather-beaten barn that leaned like it was tired of standing. A split-rail fence ran around the corral, where a single mule named Whiskey watched the world through half-lidded eyes. Jed had been alone so long he could tell the seasons not by the calendar, but by the sounds. The hollow thud of an axe in frozen wood meant January. The creak of the ice breaking on the creek meant April was on the way. And the shrill yip of coyotes on the ridge? That meant the first snow had fallen and the game was moving lower. He wasn't lonely, not the way folks in towns meant it. He had work, and he had quiet. After the war, after the gold rush madness, after seeing too much greed and too many shallow graves, quiet was worth more than gold. On that late March morning, Jed was at his chopping block, breaking down lengths. Oaf spruce for the stove. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but it was still no wind, no drifting snow. He liked mornings like that. They meant you could hear a fox's paws padding through the crust from 30 paces. That's when he heard it, a faint crunching, not animal-like, not hurried, but steady. Someone was coming up the trail. He squinted downhill, hand resting lightly on the axe handle. The trail wound through the timber in a slow curve before opening up to his yard, so all he could see at first was movement dark shapes in single file against the white snow. When they came into the open, he froze. Not riders, not miners, not even trappers. It was a line of people, women, all of them, wrapped in tattered blankets and shawls. 10 of them in all, their faces drawn and pale from cold. The one at the front, taller than the rest, wore a blanket striped with faded colors and walked with her head held high, though the effort showed in her stride. They moved without speaking, their eyes shifting from Jed to the barn to the smoke curling from his chimney. Yet's first thought wasn't, who are they? But what's chased them this far north? Out here, in late winter, nothing wandered without reason. They stopped a dozen, yards from him, their breath coming in visible puffs. The tall woman stepped forward, one hand visible from her blanket. Need? Shelter, she said slowly, her voice carrying an accent Jed recognized from his years drifting through New Mexico territory. Apache. Jed stayed still, measuring the space between them. He'd lived too long to think trouble only came with guns. Sometimes it wore a human face and a desperate plea. You're far from home, he said, his voice low, and even got the woman nodded once. Far, no home. The others stood silent, watching him as though he held their fate in his hands. The snow began falling again, light at first, and heavier, erasing their tracks behind them. Jed glanced toward the bunkhouse, then back to their faces. 30 winters alone had taught him the value of caution, but also the cost of turning away those who wouldn't last another week out here. He set the axe aside. The bunkhouse smelled of dust and old pine sap. It hadn't been used in years. Not since Jed gave up hiring hands and decided he'd rather mend fences himself than mend tempers between drunk cowpunchers. Still, it was dry. The roof didn't leak, and there was a cast-iron stove in the corner if the pipe still drew right. He lit a lantern and stepped back to let them file in. The women moved with the stiff care of people who had been walking for days. Their blankets were stiff with frost. Their moccasins left little puddles on the plank floor. The tall one, the one who had spoken, looked around once, her face unreadable, and gave a short nod to the others. They began to peel off their wet layers, steam rising as they edged closer. To the stove. "I'm Jedediah Calhoun," he said, his voice echoing in the low room. "Most folks call me Jed. This here's Lost Timber Creek, 5 miles north of Silver Gulch, and 30 from the next warm bed south." The tall woman stepped forward. "Taza," she said simply, touching her chest. Then she gestured to the others, naming them in Apache names that rolled like stones in a stream. Nahamana, Sani, Yiska, Kashina, Dasada, and more until he'd lost count. 10 names in all. Jed didn't ask questions right away. He'd learned that a man who pried too soon got answers shaped to keep him quiet. Instead, he brought in an armload of split wood, stoked the stove until it glowed, and ladled out coffee from a pot on the cabin hearth. They drank it slowly. Hands curled around the tin mugs like it was medicine. It was Taza who finally spoke. "We were from Chiricahua lands, near the warm country." Her English was halting, but her eyes were steady. "Men in our band say we help enemies. They say we give food, water, to people not ours, that we speak to Mexicans." She glanced toward one of the younger women, who kept her eyes down. "They say we are traitors." Jed listened, saying nothing. In Apache bands, exile was a punishment worse than death for many cut off from the clan, meant cut off from protection, food, the stories that bound them to the world. "They say go. No come back." Taza's jaw tightened. "We go north. Snow. Comes. Game is gone. We walk many suns." He could see it in them now, the hollow cheeks, the way they hunched against the cold, even with the stove's heat. They'd been living on scraps, probably trapping rabbits when they could, maybe eating pine nuts if they'd found any caches. "You're lucky you found my trail," Jed said at last. "Another mile east, and you'd be in a canyon that don't let you out without wings." Taza tilted her head, studying him. "We follow smoke." Jed glanced out the frosted window toward his cabin. A thin column of chimney smoke must have been the only sign of life for miles. It wasn't the first time. Someone had found him that way, but it was the first time in years. "I've got space here," he said slowly. "Bunkhouse'll do for now. You can stay till spring melt, but I don't run a charity. Everybody pulls their weight. Chopping wood, mending, feeding stock, whatever needs doing. You work, you stay warm. That's the trade." Taza translated. For the others, some nodded quickly. Others exchanged wary glances, but no one objected. That afternoon, while the snow thickened, Jed showed them the shed where he kept extra tools. Naimana took a hatchet without a word and began splitting kindling with sharp, clean strokes. Another Sawney had already hauled water from the creek before Jed could point out the bucket. By evening, the bunkhouse looked different, bedding laid out neat, wet clothes hung to dry, and the stove's heat pushing back the cold. Still, Jed kept his Winchester leaning near the door. He didn't trust easily, not anymore. But as he watched Taza ladle out a pot of stew they'd made from his venison and their own pouch of dried peppers, he caught the faintest hint of something he hadn't felt in 30 winters. Company. And it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Jed spotted them 2 days after the women settled in, while checking his trapline down along the creek. 6 sets of hoofprints, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp in the snow. The stride told him the horses were walking, not running, and the depth of the prints said they were carrying weight gear, maybe rifles. He crouched, running a gloved finger along one of the impressions. The riders had come from the south, from the low country, and turned west along the ridge trail. Out here, that wasn't the kind of route you took unless you had a reason. When he came back to the ranch, he didn't say much, just stowed his traps, brought in more firewood, and made sure his Winchester was loaded and oiled by the next morning. There was smoke on the southern ridge. Taza noticed it too. She stood in the snow beside the corral, her blanket pulled tight, eyes fixed on that thin column rising against the pale sky. She didn't ask questions, and Jed didn't offer answers. But by midday, he heard them, the rhythmic crunch of hooves. On frozen ground, the faint jingle of bridles. 6 riders, just as he'd guessed, came into view along the trail. They rode close together, their breath steaming in the cold, scarves pulled high over their faces. They didn't ride like ranchers or trappers. These were men accustomed to moving as one. Watching all angles, Jed stepped out from the cabin, axe in hand, and waited. The lead rider reined up in the yard. He was broad through the shoulders, with a scarf the color of dried blood covering the yow. Lower half of his face. His hat brim was dusted white, his eyes sharp and restless. "You Calhoun?" A man asked, his voice muffled. "I am," Jed said evenly. "We're looking for some people. Women, Apache. 10 of them. You seen anything like that come through here?" Jed didn't move. "Don't get much company up here." The man's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing, we heard they came this way. Exiles from down south. Got a price on them for theft and murder." At that, Jed saw Taza appear in the doorway of the bunkhouse, flanked by 2 of the older women. They didn't speak, didn't step forward, just watched. "Bounty hunting now, is it?" Jed said. The leader shrugged. "We're here to collect what's owed. You hand them over, and we'll be on our way." Jed leaned on the axe, his posture loose but his voice carrying weight. "I don't recall saying you could search my place. We ain't asking." The man's hand rested near his holster. Yet's Winchester was leaning by the cabin door, not 5 steps away. He took those steps slow and deliberate, picked up the rifle, and let the barrel rise until it leveled at the man's chest. "I said there's nobody here you're looking for," Jed said, his voice flat as stone. The yard went still. Snowflakes drifted down between them, catching on hat brims and shoulders. The other riders shifted in their saddles, eyes flicking between the man in front and Jed. Finally, the leader gave a short, dry laugh. "Old man, you just bought yourself some trouble." He wheeled his horse, and the others followed. They rode out slow, not in retreat, but in promise. Jed knew men like that didn't just let go, they circled back when the odds were better. When the sound of hooves faded, Taza stepped closer. "They will come again," she said. Jed nodded. "I know." He looked past her at the bunkhouse, at the 10 sets of eyes watching from within. For 30 winters, the only thing he'd had to protect was himself. Now he had something else, something more, and that meant the next time those riders came, they'd have to be ready. Jed knew enough about trouble to understand that silence meant planning. Men who had been turned away at the mouth of a rifle didn't just forget it. They came back heavier, smarter, and meaner. On the 3rd night after the riders' visit, a wind rose from the south, sharp and restless. The moon was a thin sliver behind racing clouds, casting only enough light to see the edges of the hills. Jed moved through the yard in silence, checking the latch on the barn, the bunkhouse door, and the corral gate. Taza followed him without a word, her blanket trailing like a shadow. "They are coming," she said, as if she could smell them on the wind. Jed didn't doubt her. Some people had a way of feeling trouble before it arrived. He'd been thinking on it since the day they left, how to hold a ranch against 6 armed men. The answer wasn't to stand in the open and trade lead. It was to make the land itself an ally. That afternoon, while the women hauled wood and water as if it were any other day, Jed had walked the perimeter with a spade and hatchet. He'd loosened snow in certain places, laid thin branches over shallow pits, and dragged deadfall logs into narrow choke points between the cabins and the timber. With the air cold enough to bite, he set the last of the plans in motion. Taza and 2 of the older women, Nahimana and Desada, took lanterns and the old double-barrel shotgun to the back corral. Their job was to be the light and the noise, to make anyone approaching from that side believe they were facing more than they were. The younger women, quick on their feet, hid in the root cellar with the extra cartridges. If things went bad, they could slip through the rear hatch and make for the tree line. Jed took his place in the main cabin, Winchester in hand, eyes fixed on the black edge of the yard dot. It started with the faint crunch of snow. Then another. And another. 6 silhouettes emerged from the timber, rifles slung low, moving like wolves closing in on a kill. They didn't come straight on. 2 peeled toward the bunkhouse, 2 toward the barn, and 2 angled for the corral. They meant to take the place all at once. Yet's first shot cracked the still night wide open. The lead man by the barn dropped hard, the snow puffing up around him. Shouts went up, rifles swung toward the cabin, and bullets slammed into the logs with dull, splintering thuds. From the corral came a blast from the double barrel, followed by Nahimana's fierce yell. Lantern light swung wildly, throwing the attackers into shadow and glare. One rider by the bunkhouse found the pit Jed had dug. His leg vanished up to the thigh, and his rifle went spinning into the dark. The second man there dove for cover, only to catch a round from Yet's Winchester. The fight was short and vicious, a kind that leaves the air tasting of iron and wood smoke. When the last shot faded into the hills, the wind carried nothing but the groan of the wounded and the restless stamping of Whiskey, the mule in the corral, dot by dawn. The yard told the tale. 2 men lay still under blankets of snow. 2 more limped off into the timber before first light, leaving crimson trails behind them. The rest were gone, their horses carrying them far from Lost Timber Creek. The women emerged from their places slowly, as if stepping into a world that might still bite. Taza came to Jed, her breath clouding in the cold. She reached into her blanket and pulled out a necklace, a string of bone beads and turquoise, worn smooth from years of hands passing over it. She placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. "You gave us shelter," she said. "Now we give you our loyalty." Jed looked past her to the bunkhouse, to the stove smoke curling into the pale morning sky. For 30 winters, the ranch had been his alone. Now it wasn't, and he realized he didn't want it to be anymore.